Hello and welcome to episode 2 of season 2 of Magna Indica. I'm Rishabh Gulati. With me today on this special podcast is Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee. And you'll recognize her from television from her previous books on the partition of Bengal in the East and her latest book that has come out. And this is called a fascinating story, which I've just read over the past couple of days, discussing indentured labor that went out from India. It's called The Indentured and Their Route. It's a story that desperately needs to be retold. Ambassador Mukherjee, first of all, thank you very much, ma'am, for writing this book and doing the research and putting it in such a concise and clear fashion that it's now accessible to a modern day young audience. Why did you feel that this was a subject in which you wanted to devote your time and your expertise?
My first real exposure to the uh, duplicitous standards regarding indenture struck me forcibly when I was India's ambassador to UNESCO and member of the World Heritage Committee. And the Mauritian government had brought at that time, this was way back in 2007, I think, in the Lithuania, Vilnius, the inscription of Apravasi Ghat, which is the door of no return, similar to what is in Senegal, in Gorée Island for the slaves, the door of no return for the indentured who once crossed over, never went back to their motherland. And when Apravasi Ghat was brought up for inscription, the representative of ICOMOS, who was a British lady, she tried to ridicule the entire inscription by saying that India is a miserable country, Indians were in a miserable condition, and this was a precursor to modern day immigration. And how on earth can the Mauritian government even imagine to think that there was anything at all wrong with the system? At which point the African group turned to me, the Indian ambassador, and said that, Madam Ambassador, we can explain the slave route, but only India can explain the indentured route. And I thought to myself, I can explain the indentured route because I'm a student of history. I asked myself the question, can every Indian explain the indentured route the way Africans can explain the slave route? And to me, the answer was, in my head, a resounding no. But then, Rishabh, I spoke extempore for 15 minutes on what is indenture, how it replaced slavery, how it replicated slavery, how it was human bondage of the worst variety, very similar to slavery. And at the end of my extempore presentation, the site Apravasi Ghat was inscribed by acclamation at the behest of 3 countries: United States, led by a black head of delegation, New Zealand, led by a Maori, and Netherlands, led by a very, very nice white former minister of labor, who said he was ashamed because his grandparents had links to the nefarious slave trade, and that it's never too late to make amends.
Yeah, so we never told the story. I was just mentioning before we started this that I wish that the UK Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, leads this report, because she was talking about her pride in the British Empire. And of course, she's welcome to have a pride, but she is a descendant of what would have been indentured laborers. So let's put this into context. Let me take you back, ma'am. And of course, you mentioned Apravasi Ghat and the details in your book as well. It's 1833, and the British have abolished slavery. So they are telling the world that the conceptualization of human beings owning other human beings as property to buy and sell is now illegal. We abolish it. Instead, we're going to replace it with a system of indentured labor, and it sounds great that people will get a term of employment where they can come to all these plantations that they were running in these Indo-Pacific islands, and you will get a term of labor, 4, 5, 7 years. You will get paid, you'll get paid in advance, and then you can go back home. That was the pitch they made, but what in effect, and as you read this book, you understand, it was slavery by another name. So let's take an example, ma'am, and let's talk about the figures, because sometimes we forget about the sheer numbers involved. Just like in your books on Bengal, We've discussed so many times the Bengal famine, we forget the sheer numbers involved. So you write in your book, ma'am, that very few returned to India. As a result, in Mauritius, Indians made up 72% of the population by 1910. In Fiji, Indian migrants equaled the indigenous population. So we are talking about hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions who were taken as de facto slaves to these plantations. What was the cause? What was the sales pitch made to these people? How were they duped into indentured labor?
The sales pitch, Rishabh, as you would know, as a student of history like me, was the infamous effect of colonization on Bengal and in the east. So you had the permanent settlement, you had the forcible growing of opium, you had the peasants being told they could not grow food even for their own families. The opium was shipped to China to enslave a whole generation of Chinese. And you had fairly respectable peasants, landowners, becoming landless and thrown out of their land and starving. And you had a series of famines. Then you had the recruiters being sent and telling them that you want a good life abroad, which is a story which the representative of ECOMOS told the World Heritage Committee, as I explained earlier. And you don't have to cross the Kalapani. That was another very interesting concept. They knew that there were many who did not want to cross the Kalapani. So they used the Bhojpuri word for island, which is called Tapo. And they said, you're going to a small Tapo, which is hardly 1 hour or 2 hours drive away from Kolkata harbor. They were taken in the same slave ships, but without chains. The difference, the superficial difference, was what is called the Girmit. The Girmit was a paper written in English to which illiterate Indians, half starved as they were because of the famine and the conditions of colonization, not because India was a country of half starved people, they put their thumbprint on the Girmit and they became the Girmitias. And later, as I've explained, they were called disparagingly the coolies, the coolie route, the Girmitia route, or as they say in French, la route des engagés. It's the same thing.
Okay.
They were sent on those ships, and that is how they made up.
Okay, so let's put this into genesis, and you get this flavor as you read the book. It's so easy to understand after having read this book how the modus operandi was working. So now we have abolished slavery. So technically, on these plantations all over the Caribbean and all over, Seychelles, Madagascar, Mauritius, Fiji, all of the places where you have these cotton, sugarcane, and that's exactly where the slave labor in the United States continued. But in the British colonies, you're saying, okay, we're going to abolish slavery, but we're going to convince the freed slaves to go back and work on these plantations. And the freed slaves say, no, thank you very much. We've experienced this. We know what you've done. Okay. And this is not how we see our futures. So they move on. The Anglo-Saxon don't want to come and become the labor in these plantations. So you have a massive labor shortage. How do you fill the labor shortage? You fill the labor shortage, ladies and gentlemen, by first creating the indigo famine, the opium famine, as Ambassador Mukherjee has mentioned. You force the Indian farmers to grow indigo, which is not a food crop. You force them to grow opium, which you are then, of course, further exporting in a carry trade to China and harming that country. So you create famine, and as we've discussed several times, more people have died in the famines in India. Then one can argue that Germany lost in the first and second world wars, 6 million, 7 million. Now these people are hungry, and then you give them a fig leaf. And it's done in a modern context also. Somebody is told, you'll get a great job in the Middle East. You'll get a great job, and once you reach that, they take away your passport and will make you serve and pay you very little. But this was done at a scale. Now you mentioned the coolie route. You mentioned the Girmit. They actually went about not slavers but Girmitias, okay, who were paid for finding these indentured laborers. And you mentioned in your book that you were being paid 35 for female Girmitias and 25 for male Girmitias. We're still talking about the 19th century, the mid-19th century. Then you mentioned after 1868, when the colonial government fixed a quota of 40 women per 100 men for every ship carrying the indentured, it was the additional pressure on the arakatiyas, and these are the recruiters, to recruit women, resulting in malpractice and forced migrations. So they were not recruiting, they were coercing and deceiving, perhaps even kidnapping and abducting. This is how it was happening, and it was a business. They were getting paid for it. This was no different than selling someone into slavery.
Absolutely. It was human trafficking on a very large scale. And I'm glad you spoke about the problem of women because I have a whole different chapter about the whole unfortunate and untold history of indentured women and how they were judged by Victorian morality, prevailing not just in England but also in India, and how these indentured women who were being forced into indenture because their husbands had left or they were destitute, they were all portrayed as prostitutes without morals, etc., etc. And theirs remained a story without a narrator till I wrote my book. But to come back to your question about how they made up 50% of the population in Mauritius, is because Mauritius, unlike some other countries that you've mentioned, was unpopulated until the Dutch came and killed a bird called the dodo, except one bird, which is in the National Museum. It was totally unpopulated. It was then populated by slaves who were treated terribly. They were all from Africa. And when slavery was abolished and the sugar plantations fell silent, and the island, which was under French colonial rule, went to British colonial rule, the British then decided to bring these people from the eastern part of India. And they were not told that they have to cultivate sugarcane, and they did not know how to cultivate sugarcane. They were forced to cultivate sugarcane. And moreover, another very sad part of the crossing, which I've written about, is that since the ships were filled with contaminated water, cholera contaminated water from the Hooghly River, many got cholera and they were mercilessly thrown overboard while they were still alive. And in many parts of the Caribbean where they were taken to, and in Reunion Island, the quarantine was such that the healthy were put along with those suffering from cholera, so that the cholera killed off a lot of healthy people who otherwise need not have contracted cholera. So it was a horrific story of human bondage, human suffering, and total violation of human rights of the human person in a manner very similar to slavery, which is why I have said that the brown indentured and the black slave are two sides of the same colonial coin, both representing a method by which the maximum profit goes to the mother country.
And this has never been addressed
Never.
in the concept of the world, even in the countries which are now politically led by the descendants of indentured labor, so much so that I just mentioned that the Home Secretary of the United Kingdom today is a descendant of what would have been indentured laborers.
Definitely.
And she's proud
She is a
of the
descendant.
British Empire. So she herself is not aware of her own history because the story has never been well told. And you mentioned this in the book. So let me give the sales pitch. And this is mentioned on page 98 of the book. What was promised? The promise was 7 rupees salary per month, accommodation for free, food for free, and a free trip back to India. This is the promise they made. What really happened? And let me read this. Suicide became a common phenomenon. Available records show 25% of the Indian indentured workers, including women, died on Reunion Island. 1 in 4 died. Those who died en route, these are the people who never even made it in the inhuman conditions they were kept in. And the subhuman conditions were designed as a disciplinary tactic, that you are treating these people as inferior to impose discipline. And then you mentioned towards the end of this chapter, ma'am, reconciliation was never attempted then or now. So here we are, 150 years later, still finding it difficult to address the reality of what actually happened. So now the sales pitch, ma'am, has been made to me that look, we have ruined your farming economy here. You people who've been running a farming civilization which has been unbroken for 5,000 years now are dying in hunger. But we have a brilliant new scheme. Why don't you go out to this tiny island where nobody lives, and you grow sugarcane for us? We'll pay you 7 rupees a month, and we'll give you, accommodation. It's like sounds like a great holiday, and a working holiday, and we'll get you a trip back to India. Here's your contract for 7 years, and here's 3 months advance pay. Once that person is then either coerced, deceived, recruited, kidnapped, or abducted, what happens next? Where do they board the ship? Where do they go? And how are they treated?
They board the ship in Kolkata. In fact, there's a memorial that has been put up recently by the government of Suriname, along with the Indian government. It's the photo of it is in my book.
Yeah.
They take the ship not knowing exactly where is the destination and how far is the destination. That's the first problem. The second is that those who were recruited earlier there were only men who were recruited. When they reached, they found that there were no women at all, and that the promised journey back home kept getting extended. Like they would say 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 10 years, they were not given the free journey back home. And because of that, and because of social unrest, the pressure was then put on the Arkatias, the recruiters, to find women. It wasn't that easy to find women, but it is also not true that the women who volunteered were necessarily of loose moral character. Many of them were actually either widows or whose husbands were working in far off destinations, and they wanted to rejoin them. But what happened was that when they went there, the women were exploited doubly, because they had to look after the home, the family, the cooking, work on the sugar plantations, and also be abused by the white overseer, etc. And when I said reconciliation was never possible, I was also speaking on the context of the British being famous for divide and rule. Wherever they took the Indians, where there was an indigenous population of blacks, large one, a very small one in Mauritius. Most of the slaves went back to Africa. But for instance, in Fiji, the system they practiced was a kind of apartheid, where they used all kinds of politically unacceptable words to define one community to another, kept them separate, did not allow any social intercourse, did not allow marriage, did not allow the children to go to the same schools. And as a result, both communities, one descendant from slaves and the other from indentured, grew up permanently antagonistic to each other. So when you have a nation state, I call Mauritius a rainbow nation, or South Africa, because reconciliation happened there. But I cannot call Fiji a rainbow nation, because no reconciliation was ever attempted.
No, it was never attempted.
It was never attempted. And to me, having been to Fiji twice, it would appear to me that now reconciliation is not going to be possible.
But I've studied indentured labor in school. It was 3 lines. Okay. So let me read out 3 lines, because the story ma'am has already mentioned. It's on page 48 of our book, and it's followed by a poem. And the context is the Laal Rookh. This is the first ship to carry Indian indentured laborers to the plantation colony of Suriname from Calcutta. And there's a photograph in a book of them as they deboarded in Suriname. And let me just quote this. A descendant of the bonded from Suriname, Rabin Baldev Singh, wrote poignantly of that painful journey of his ancestors in the first ship, the Laal Rookh, that set sail with the indenture from Calcutta to Suriname. This trek is so lonely under the spell of fate. I am not the only one in this narrowness of imprisonment, where men play men, where men surpass animals. This is surely no dream. This is weeping. This is grief. No, this trek will not lead to liberation. It is the isolated destination in hell. Why have we found 150 years later so difficult to even examine or tell this story? I can understand why the British would find it awkward. Why have we found it so awkward, unable to do so? And you have many poems, including the statistics, are all there in the book, and the photographs. So it's worth going through. We don't have time for all of that. I'll recommend you read the book. But why we found it so difficult to talk about it?
I think we found it difficult to talk about it. Because it is actually embarrassing. For me, it's embarrassing as a student of Indian history and as a diplomat of 39 years standing to tell ourselves again and again how why were Indians duped so easily. First, in the Battle of Plassey, which we lost, and Bengal got lost, was lost to the British and then India. And then 1.5 million Indians were sent as indentured. Why did we not realize faster? Fortunately, as you rightly pointed out, Madan Mohan Malviya and then Gandhi spoke up and insisted that the indenture system must be abolished. But it was a very big struggle because there were many, even within India in the beginning, let's say among the Bhadraloks of Bengal, uh, who thought that this was a very fine way of giving employment to Indians. They did not understand at all what indentured was. In fact, it was the Marwaris of Bengal who, when they started setting up their nascent industries, they realized that all the labor has been diverted for British colonial purposes to fuel the sugar plantations and maximize profits. There was no labor for Indian business in India. Even then, the story never got told. And today, it is important for every Indian to understand that just as Hegel said, that if you don't know your history, history can repeat itself. That's the reason I wrote the book, Rishabh, because I want not just Indians. This book is being translated into French as I speak in Mauritius because the Reunion Island and the Mauritians want to read it in French. They want to read it in Bhojpuri. They want to read it in Hindi because this book has found resonance on 22 countries on the indentured labor route. And it is my dream that one day that indentured labor route will be in the memory of all humanity, like the slave route, because basically there was no difference at all
No,
except for the
but it's a
chains.
matter of discovery, and it's a matter of discovery of how many of us, perhaps you and me, that we would have had relatives of our great uh, grandparents, our forefathers and foremothers, some of whom would have been taken away, many forcibly, either because of conditions created or because of deception or de facto kidnapping, because they were treated like coolies. You've seen the visuals of how the British used to treat people on the streets in India. Many were left dying. So let's bring this back into a modern context, ma'am, because towards the end of the group, you mentioned by 1945, the Fijian Indians constituted the majority of the population. By 1947, when India became independent, many Fijian Indians advocated a new Fiji attached as a form of dominion with the status of dominion to India. India, on the other hand, the leaders of the Indo-Fijians were committed to being citizens of the new nation state of Fiji formed in 1970. They called for a new emphasis on being fully Fijian. So this is a very interesting dynamic, is that you have an Indian heritage, but you have developed a national identity, and that national identity is now supreme, as it should be in a modern context. So then there lies the difficult dichotomy, ma'am, of us having to confront it, the Fijians having to confront it, the Mauritians having to confront it, at least a large majority of their populations in Seychelles, in Madagascar, all the way down to the Caribbean, having to confront it. Why are we not being able to come together and say that there, at the very least, the museums need to be made, the history months need to be created, the education to our children needs to be provided. If not, the atrocities and the accountabilities need to be, well, at least marked out so that in the modern context, a next person, a next child of indenture, like a future Suella Braverman, cannot hold her head up in the House of Commons and say, I'm proud of the British Empire.
I think in Suella Braverman's case, Rishabh, it is a case of denial because the children, the descendants of the indentured, were told through India's oral traditions, which have never died in thousands of years, exactly what happened. But you're very right. We need to teach, we need to disseminate, we need to have museums to explain what happened. We also need to understand the whole dynamics of what happened in Fiji, which are totally different from what happened in Mauritius, because in Fiji, the descendants of the Indian indentured went into white collared professions, whereas the others went into the police and military, etc. So when there was a clash of political power and the demand for equal power for those of Indian origin and those of indigenous origin, those of Indian origin lost out because they did not control the instruments of political power. Whereas in Mauritius, they are fully integrated into the population. And reunion, as I've written about, is a very, very sad story, because in reunion, they were what you call in French, Rishabh, the racinated, the raciné. The raciné means you destroy the roots of the person. So they were not allowed to record their names, the name of the village they came from, the language they spoke, etc. So, for instance, when I go to Reunion Island, I'm treated like a heroine because they can speak to me in the only language they speak, which I speak very unusually,
French.
which is French. They speak no other language, no
Most.
English, no Tamil, nothing. And so when they come to India also, they need an interpreter. And very often they call me, and then I ask the French embassy to give them an interpreter when they go down to see their villages, because nobody in India understands what they are saying.
It's the
But if you look at them, Rishabh, they look 100% Indian.
it's the microcosm of what they wanted to do in India but failed.
They
Is
failed.
completely wipe out
but
your identity, your
yes.
history, your culture, your language. They tried to do it, but the scale was too large. But in these microcosms of places where they were able to do it,
Very scary.
they turned you into a ghost. You don't know who your parents were, your grandparents were. You probably orphaned on the ship because your parents died of cholera, and you have no idea where you came from. You don't understand your mother tongue, and all you know is the environment around you, and the environment around you is basically de facto slave labor.
I'd like to just add one small thing here, which is that this book has been praised by Mukeshwar Chuni, former culture minister of Mauritius, former ambassador of Mauritius to India, great friend. He asked me when I first met him in Mauritius, Madam Ambassador, have you ever met a man in India called Chuni? So I said, no. He said, therein lies a very sad tale, that my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother on the crossing got cholera, and they were thrown overboard while they were still alive. They had one child who was looked after by the other Girmitias and was called in Bhojpuri Chunni Munni. When they got off the ship in Apravasi Ghat, the white overseer said, what is the name of this child? Where are the parents? The parents are dead. Okay, he's an orphan. What is his name? So those labor who didn't know what he was saying, they kept saying Chunni Munni, Chunni Munni. And that is how his name became Chunni. And today, so many generations later, he has served as the culture minister of Mauritius, Mauritius ambassador to India, and he is right now the president of Gopio International. And he's going to be launching my book in Mauritius next month. So, yes, the word Chunni demonstrates in a way also the racinement, the cutting off the roots, because it means, for an Indian, it means nothing. But for those in Mauritius who have descended from the Chunnis, it means a whole family name, which is the whole tragedy of the issue of identity, and which is why I wrote in my book, The Indentured and Their Root, a relentless quest for identity, because it was the Indian identity, the Indian culture, the Indian civilization, the Indian language, the Indian food, which kept them sane, which kept them alive, and which helped them to develop a rainbow culture with the best of both nations. The only place where it failed was in Fiji for the reasons I mentioned, and in Reunion because they were forced to forget their roots. So they have no roots. Now they search for those roots, and they have set up schools there in Reunion to learn Hindi, to learn Tamil, to learn Bharatnatyam, to read Indian books. So surely, Rishabh, I hope for them that 50 years from now, the Racine of Reunion Island too will be able to rediscover their Indian
even
roots.
today, we sit in a broader Commonwealth, and the future of the Commonwealth is uncertain because there are countries out there looking to leave. And what is this Commonwealth of Nations that is unable to address a fact? And the fact is simple. When you think of slavery, you think of Africans turned into slaves. You not for a second think that 1.5 million Indians, and that's what the records say. We don't know. It probably was more.
More.
And how the entire system worked of first wreck and deprave your existing economy, which is doing fine for thousands of years. How you come in, you create deprivation, you create famine. Once you have created famine, once you have created havoc, then you make hay. And then a history of peoples was changed due to this. And we, as a modern day civilizations, our diaspora has yet to reconcile itself. You mentioned truth and reconciliation. We have not reconciled. We have not studied. At least an academic effort has now been made. It gives us an opportunity to have these conversations which so desperately need to be had. Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, thank you for, first of all, writing this fabulous book and joining us on this edition of Magna Indica.
Thank you so much, Rishabh. It was a pleasure.
I am going to put a link of this series on our on a separate YouTube channel from NewsX as well. So it makes it easier for people to find. We'll put the link in the description so that you can find Magna Indica separately as well as we now roll on to season 2. My thanks to the good ambassador, and thank you for joining us and watching. Thank you.
Thank you very much.